Hello, welcome to this video. Some years ago I was asked if I wished to inherit any of the possessions of my recently deceased grandfather. I chose an upright piano and a few of his books. This was one of them. The Life of Alexander the Great. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with Alexander the Great, he is world renowned for leading arguably the most successful military campaign of all time ever, conquering a huge swathe of the world in the process. He successfully laid siege to dozens of cities and towns. He defeated numerous opposing armies, often in less than favourable conditions. And he upheld the governance of his empire with a high degree of success over the span of his remarkably short lifetime. Now, there are many other sources that will go into far greater historical detail on the man than I intend to do here. What I intend to do here is point out some things that really stuck with me after reading this particular book. I came to realise that he was one of the most successful gamblers of the fates, as well as possessing the psychology that allowed him to become a supreme tactician and leader, the likes of which, to my knowledge, have never really been matched since. His deeds are legendary, and far greater in number than the few I will mention in this video here today. So if you make it to the end and feel inspired by it, I implore you to look into his story more deeply, for he is a truly fascinating character of human history. And I think it's fair to say that viewed through the modern lens of the rational world of today, he can certainly be considered a bleeding lunatic. And here are the reasons why.
1. He was not shy of a fight. Throughout the accounts of Alexander, he is often found at the front amongst his men, and he sustained various wounds during his campaigns. Here is one such example.
During the fight, Alexander's spear was broken. He called on Aratus, one of his grooms, for another, but Aratus was himself in difficulties for the same reason, though still fighting gallantly enough with the remaining half of his weapon. Showing it to Alexander, he called out to him to ask someone else, and Demaratus the Corinthian, one of Alexander's personal bodyguard, gave him his spear. The fresh weapon in his hand, he caught sight of Mithridates, Darius' son-in-law, riding with a squadron of horse in wedge formation, far ahead of the main body. Instantly he galloped out in front of his men, struck Mithridates in the face with his spear, and hurled him to the ground. Rosaces then rode at Alexander with his scimitar, and aiming a blow at his head, sliced off part of his helmet, which nevertheless dulled the full force of the impact. A moment later Alexander was on him, and he fell with a spear thrust through his cuirass into his breast. Now Mithridates had his scimitar raised, ready for a blow at Alexander from behind. But Clytus, son of Dropides, was too quick for him, and severed his shoulder with a single stroke. Meanwhile, Alexander's party was being steadily reinforced by the mounted troops, as one after another they succeeded in getting up out of the river and joining him.
2. He once drank a potion that could very well have been laced with poison to prove his loyalty and friendship to one of his men. The manner in which Alexander took this huge gamble with his own life shows not only his belief in himself and his destiny, but also his deep understanding of the psychology of an incredible leader.
About this time, Alexander had a bout of sickness. The cause of it, according to Aristobulus' account, was exhaustion, but others say that he plunged into the river Cydnus for a swim, as he was sweating with heat and could not resist the pleasure of a bathe. The Cydnus runs right through Tarsus, and as it rises in Mount Taurus and flows through open country, its waters are clear and cold. The result was that Alexander was seized by a convulsion, followed by high fever and sleepless nights. All his doctors but one despaired of his life, but Philip of Acarnania, who attended him, and was not only a trusted physician but a good soldier as well, proposed to give him a purgative. Alexander consented to take it, and just as Philip was preparing the draught, Alexander was handed a note from Parmenio. "Beware of Philip," the note read. "I am informed that he has been bribed by Darius to poison you." Alexander read the warning, and with the paper still in his hand, took the cup of medicine and then passed the note to Philip. Philip read it, and while he was reading, Alexander swallowed the dose. It was immediately clear that there was nothing wrong with Philip's medicine. He showed no alarm at Parmenio's warning, but simply advised Alexander to continue to follow his instructions, for if he did, he would recover. The dose had its due effect and brought relief, and from that moment Philip knew that Alexander was his faithful friend. It was evident also to everyone else about his person, both that he was firm in his refusal to suspect treachery in friends, and could look unmoved upon death.
3. He had no tolerance for cowards. The King of Persia fled from battle when it was becoming clear that Alexander's force had defeated him. He then wrote a letter to Alexander asking for peace and joint rule of Persia. This was Alexander's response.
Your ancestors invaded Macedonia and Greece and caused havoc in our country. We had done nothing to provoke them. As supreme commander of all Greece, I invaded Asia because I wished to punish Persia for this act, an act which must be laid wholly to your charge. You sent aid to the people of Perinthus in their rebellion against my father. Ocus sent an army into Thrace, which was a part of our dominions. My father was killed by assassins whom, as you openly boasted in your letters, you yourselves hired to commit the crime. Having murdered Arses with Bagos's help, you unjustly and illegally seized the throne, thereby committing a crime against your country. You sent the Greeks false information about me in the hope of making them my enemies. You attempted to supply the Greeks with money, which only the Lacedaemonians were willing to accept. Your agents corrupted my friends and tried to wreck the peace which I had established in Greece. And then it was that I took the field against you, but it was you who began the quarrel. First I defeated in battle your generals and satraps. Now I have defeated yourself and the army you led. By God's help, I am the master of your country, and I have made myself responsible for the survivors of your army who fled to me for refuge. Far from being detained by force, they are serving of their own free will under my command. Come to me, therefore, as you would come to the lord of the continent of Asia. Should you fear to suffer any indignity at my hands, then send some of your friends, and I will give them the proper guarantees. Come then, and ask me for your mother, your wife, and your children, and anything else you please, for you shall have them, and whatever besides you can persuade me to give you. And in future, let any communication you wish to make with me be addressed to the King of all Asia. Do not write to me as to an equal. Everything you possess is now mine, so if you should want anything, let me know in the proper terms, or I shall take steps to deal with you as a criminal. If, on the other hand, you wish to dispute your throne, stand and fight for it, and do not run away. Wherever you may hide yourself, be sure I shall seek you out.
4. He could not be swayed by riches. The King of Persia once again reached out with diplomacy as he continued to lose his lands, and once again Alexander was steadfast in his demands that honour be satisfied.
While Alexander was still occupied with the siege, he was visited by envoys from Darius, who in the king's name offered a sum of 10,000 talents in exchange for his mother, wife and children. They further proposed that all the territory west of the Euphrates, right to the Aegean Sea, should belong to Alexander, who should seal his bond of friendship and alliance with Persia by marrying Darius's daughter. These proposals were made known at a meeting of Alexander's personal advisers, and Parmenio, according to all reports, declared that were he Alexander, he would be happy to end the war on such terms and be done with any further adventures. That, replied Alexander, is what I should do were I Parmenio. But since I am Alexander, I shall send Darius a different answer. And send it he did. He had no need, he wrote, of Darius's money, nor was there any call upon him to accept a part of the continent in place of the whole. All Asia, including its treasure, was already his property, and if he wished to marry Darius's daughter, he would do so, whether Darius liked it or not. If, moreover, Darius wanted kindliness and consideration at his hands, he must come to ask for it in person. Upon receiving this reply, Darius abandoned all thought of coming to terms and began once more to prepare for war.
5. After staying true to his word and relentlessly hounding the King of Persia to his death, he then treated the dead king with a far greater respect than he had done in life. In the end, the King of Persia eventually succumbed not to the hands of Alexander, who hounded him, but to the hands of his own men who betrayed him. His story is a sad one, but crucial to understanding Alexander's mind.
Alexander himself then started off again at dusk with all the speed he could make, and covering some 50 miles in the course of the night came up with the Persians just as dawn was breaking. They were straggling along unarmed. Only a few made any offer of resistance. Most of them incontinently fled the moment they saw it was Alexander himself who was upon them. Those who attempted to fight also made off after losing a few men. Bessus and his friends did not at once abandon the attempt to get Darius away in the wagon, but when Alexander was close upon them, Narbazanes and Barzientus struck him down and left him, and made their escape with 600 horsemen. The wound proved fatal, and Darius died shortly afterwards, before Alexander could see him. Alexander sent Darius's body to Persepolis to be buried in the royal tombs like the kings before him. He appointed a Parthian named Emancipated as governor of Parthia and Hyrcania. He was one of Mazak's parties who had surrendered Egypt to Alexander, till Ptolemus, son of Pithophanes, was given a post to assist him in keeping an eye on things in the two provinces. Such was the end of Darius. He died in July during the archonship of Aristophon in Athens. In military matters he was the feeblest and most incompetent of men. In other spheres his conduct appears to have been moderate and decent, though the truth may well be that, as his ascension to the throne coincided with the declaration of war by Macedon and Greece, he had no opportunity to play the tyrant. In the circumstances, being himself in greater peril than his subjects, he could hardly have treated them with the usual cruelty of an oriental despot, even had he wished to do so. His life was an unbroken series of disasters from the moment of his ascension to the throne. He was immediately faced by the defeat of his satraps and their mounted troops on the Granicus. The loss of Ionia and Aelios swiftly followed, and the two Phrygias, Lydia and Ulcaria, except Halicarnassus. Soon afterwards Halicarnassus too was gone, and the whole coast as far as Cilicia. Then came his own defeat at Issus, and the bitter sight of his mother, wife, and children as prisoners in enemy hands. The loss of Phoenicia and Egypt was followed by the debacle at Arbelia, his own shameful flight from the field, and the destruction of the mightiest army of the whole East. Then a homeless fugitive in the land he once ruled, ruthlessly betrayed by his own guards, a monarch in chains, contemptuously smuggled away from the scene of his former glory, he was finally murdered by the treachery of those most bound in duty to serve him. Such was the unhappy life of Darius. Dead, he was more fortunate, for he was buried in the royal tomb. His children were given by Alexander the same upbringing and education they would have had if he had still been king, and his daughter became Alexander's wife. He was about 50 when he died.
6. Plots against him were dealt with the utmost ruthlessness. If Alexander found out you had conspired against him, or even if you were associated with the conspirators, you would swiftly be dealt with.
It was here, too, that Alexander learned of Philotas's plot against his life. According to Ptolemy and Aristobulus, information of what was going on had come to his ears before, whilst he was in Egypt, but he had refused to believe it, for Philotas had long been his friend. He had trusted him, and had also bestowed the highest honours upon his father, Parmenio. Ptolemy's account of what now occurred is this. Philotas was brought before the Macedonians to stand his trial. Alexander made his accusation in no uncertain terms, and Philotas answered the charge. Then the persons who had reported the affair came forward with various irrefutable proofs of his own guilt, and that of his fellow conspirators, of which the most damning was that he admitted knowledge of a plot against Alexander, but had said nothing about it, in spite of the fact that he was in the habit of visiting Alexander's tent twice a day. Thereupon he was shot by the Macedonians, and the others who were concerned in the conspiracy shared the same fate. Parmenio was executed as well. Polydamas, one of the Hetairai, was sent to him with a letter from Alexander, addressed to Cleander, Siticles, and Menidas, 3 generals in Media, who had been posted to the army which Parmenio commanded. It was they who put him to death. The reason for Parmenio's execution may have been that Alexander could not believe that he had no share in his son's conspiracy. On the other hand, even granting his innocence, his living on after his son's execution was already in fact a danger. For he was a man of immense prestige. He had great influence not only with Alexander himself, but also with the army, and not alone with the Macedonian units, but also with the mercenary soldiers, whom so often by Alexander's orders, and with Alexander's approbation, he had led on special missions, or in the ordinary course of duty.
7. As were those who plotted against his very enemies. Alexander was a man who could not stand for disloyalty, even when it benefited his own ends.
The little settlement was fortified more or less, having an outer wall with gates in it. Ptolemy cordoned it off with his mounted troops, and announced to the Persians inside that if they gave Bessus up, they would be allowed to go without molestation. He was accordingly admitted, whereupon he seized Bessus and again withdrew, sending off a messenger to ask Alexander how he wished Bessus to be brought into his presence. Alexander replied that he must be stripped of his clothes and led in a dog collar, and made to stand on the right of the road along which he and his army would pass. The order was obeyed, and when Alexander saw him there, he stopped his chariot and asked him why he had treated Darius, his king, kinsman, and benefactor, so shamefully, first seizing him, then hurrying him off in chains, and finally murdering him. Bessus answered that the decision to do what he had done was not his alone. Everyone close to Darius at that time had shared in it, and their object was to win Alexander's favour and so save their lives. At this, Alexander ordered him to be scourged, and at every lash a crier was to repeat the words of reproach he had himself used as he asked the reason for his treachery. After this humiliating punishment, he was sent away to Bactra to be executed.
8. He killed his friend in a drunken argument, then lamented him for 3 days. Such a deed undoubtedly affected his mental state, as well as those of his men around him.
Clytus could control himself no longer. He began to magnify Philip's achievements and belittle Alexander's. His words came pouring out. He was by now very drunk indeed, and among much else he taunted Alexander with the reminder that he had saved his life when they fought the Persian cavalry on the Granicus. "This is the hand," he cried, holding it out with a flourish, "that saved you, Alexander, on that day." Alexander could stand no more drunken abuse from his friend. Angrily he leapt from his seat as if to strike him, but the others held him back. Clytus continued to pour out his insulting remarks, and Alexander called for the guard. No one answered. "What?" he cried. "Have I nothing left of royalty but the name? Am I to be like Darius, dragged in chains by Bessus and his cronies?" Now nobody could hold him. Springing to his feet, he snatched a spear from one of the attendants and struck Clytus dead. Accounts of this incident differ. Some authorities say it was not a spear but a pike. Aristobulus does not mention the occasion of the drinking bout. According to him, Clytus need not have been killed but for his own action. For when Alexander sprang up in rage to kill him, Ptolemy, son of Lagus, a member of the king's personal guard, hurried him out of the door and over the wall and ditch of the fortress. But unable to control himself, he went back to the banquet room and met Alexander just at the moment when he was calling his name. "Here I am, Alexander!" he cried, and as he spoke, the blow fell. Personally, I strongly depreciate Clytus's unseemly behaviour to his sovereign, and for Alexander I feel pity, in that he showed himself on this occasion the slave of anger and drunkenness, two vices to neither of which a self-respecting man should ever yield. But when the deed was done, Alexander immediately felt its horror, and for that I admire him. Some have said that he fixed the butt of his pike against the wall, meaning to fall upon it himself, because a man who murdered his friend when his wits were fuddled with wine was not fit to live. Most writers, however, say nothing of this. They tell us that Alexander lay on his bed in tears, calling the name of Clytus and of his sister Lenice, who had been his nurse. "Ah," he cried, "a good return I have made you for your care. Now I am a man. You have lived to see your sons die fighting for me, and now with my own hand I have killed your brother." Again and again he called himself the murderer of his friend, and for 3 days lay without food or drink, careless of all personal comfort.
9. He threatened to kill every man in a country unless his horse was returned. The man clearly had a bond with the animal, and considering how nutty he was, it wouldn't have surprised me if he had started the killings. Luckily, the horse was returned.
Near the scene of the battle and the spot where he crossed the Hydaspes, Alexander founded 2 cities. One he called Naesia to commemorate his victory, the other Bucephale, in memory of his horse Bucephalus, who died in that country, not of hurts received in battle, but of old age and exhaustion. He was about 30 and worn out. In former days he had shared with Alexander many a danger and many a weary march. No one ever rode him but his master, for he would never permit anyone else to mount him. He was a big horse, high-spirited, a noble creature. He was branded with the figure of an ox head, whence his name, though some have said that the name came from a white mark on his head, shaped like the head of an ox. This was the only bit of white on his body, all the rest of him being black. In Ushia once, Alexander lost him and issued an edict that he would kill every man in the country unless he was brought back, as he promptly was. The story is evidence both of the fear which Alexander inspired and of his devotion to Bucephalus. But I must say no more. What I have written in Bucephalus's praise, I have written for Alexander's sake.
10. Alexander's only real defeat was to the wishes of his men. Tired of war, Alexander's men tried to reason with him.
Are you not aware that if Heracles, my ancestor, had gone no further than Tiryns or Argos, or even than the Peloponnese or Thebes, he could never have won the glory which changed him from a man into a god, actual or apparent? Even Dionysus, who was a god indeed, in a sense beyond what is applicable to Heracles, faced not a few laborious tasks. Yet we have done more. We have passed beyond Nysa, and we have taken the rock of Aranos, which Heracles himself could not take. Come then, add the rest of Asia to what you already possess, a small addition to the great sum of your conquests. What great or noble work could we ourselves have achieved had we thought it enough, living at ease in Macedon, merely to guard our homes, accepting no burden beyond checking the encroachment of the Thracians on our borders, or the Illyrians or Tribalians, or perhaps such Greeks as might prove a menace to our comfort? I could not have blamed you for being the first to lose heart, if I, your commander, had not shared in your exhausting marches and your perilous campaigns. It would have been natural enough if you had done all the work merely for others to reap the reward, but it is not so. You and I, gentlemen, have shared the labour and shared the danger, and the rewards are for us all. The conquered territory belongs to you. From your ranks the governors of it are chosen. Already the greater part of its treasure passes into your hands, and when all Asia is overrun, then indeed I will go further than the mere satisfaction of your ambitions. The utmost hopes of riches or power which each one of you cherishes will be far surpassed, and whoever wishes to return home will be allowed to go, either with me or without me. I will make those who stay the envy of those who return. When Alexander ended, there was a long silence. The officers present were not willing to accept what he had said, yet no one liked to risk an unprepared reply. Several times Alexander invited comment, should any wish to give it, and genuinely hold different views from those he had expressed. But in spite of his invitation, nothing was said, until at last Coenus, son of Polymocrates, plucked up his courage to speak. "Sir," he said, "we appreciate the fact that you do not demand from us unreasoning obedience. You have made it clear to us that you will lead us on only after winning our consent, and failing that you will not use compulsion. This being so, I do not propose to speak on behalf of the officers here assembled, as we, by virtue of our rank and authority, have already received the rewards of our services, and are naturally concerned more than the men are to further your interests. I shall speak, therefore, for the common soldiers, not by any means with the purpose of echoing their sentiments, but saying what I believe will tend to your present advantage and our future security. My age, the repute which, by your favour, I enjoy among my comrades, and the unhesitating courage I have hitherto displayed in all dangers and difficulties, gives me the right to declare what I believe to be the soundest policy. Very well. Then, precisely in proportion to the number and magnitude of the achievements wrought by you, our leader, and by the men who marched from home under your command, I judge it best to set some limit to further enterprise. You know the number of Greeks and Macedonians who started upon this campaign, and you could see how many of us are left today. The Thessalians you sent home from Bactria because you knew their hearts were no longer in their work, and it was wisely done. Other Greeks have been settled in the new towns you have founded, where they remain not always willingly. Others, again, together with our own Macedonians, continue to share with you the dangers and hardships of war. And of these, some have been killed, some disabled by wounds, have been left behind in various parts of Asia, and more still have died of sickness, so that only a few from that great army are left, a small remnant broken in health, their old vigour and determination gone. Every man of them longs to see his parents again if they yet survive, or his wife, or his children. All are yearning for the familiar earth of home, hoping, pardonably enough, to live, to revisit it, no longer in poverty and obscurity, but famous and enriched by the treasure you have enabled them to win. Do not try to lead men who are unwilling to follow you. If their heart is not in it, you will never find the old spirit or the old courage. Consent rather yourself to return to your mother and your home. Once there, you may bring good government to Greece and enter your ancestral house with all the glory of the many great victories won in this campaign. And then, should you so desire it, you may begin again and undertake a new expedition against these Indians of the East, or if you prefer, to the Black Sea or to Carthage and the Libyan territories beyond. It is for you to decide. Other troops, Greek and Macedonian, will follow you, young, fresh troops to take the place of your war-weary veterans, still ignorant of the horrors of war and full of hope for what the future may bring. These men will follow you with all the more eagerness in that they have seen your old campaigners come safely home again, no longer poor and nameless, but loaded with money and fame. Sir, if there is one thing above all others a successful man should know, it is when to stop. Assuredly, for a commander like yourself, with an army like ours, there is nothing to fear from any enemy, but luck, remember, is an unpredictable thing, and against what it may bring, no man has any defence. Coenus's words were greeted with applause. Some even wept, which was proof enough of their reluctance to prolong the campaign, and of how happy they would be should the order be given to turn back. Alexander resented the freedom with which Coenus had spoken, and the poor spirit shown by the other officers, and dismissed the conference. Next day he summoned the same officers to his presence, and angrily declared that, though he would put pressure on no Macedonian to accompany him, he himself was resolved to go on. "I shall have others," he cried, "who will need no compulsion to follow their king. If you wish to go home, you are at liberty to do so, and you may tell your people there that you deserted your king in the midst of his enemies." Thereupon he withdrew to his tent, and for the rest of that day and for 2 days following refused to allow anyone to see him, even members of the hetairai. His hope was that the various commanders, both of his Macedonian and allied contingents, might change their minds and become readier to listen to him. For after all, in a crowd of soldiers, such sudden reversals of feeling are common enough. Their silence, however, remained absolute and unbroken. The men were angry at Alexander's burst of temper, and determined not to let it influence them. But in spite of their obvious hostility, Alexander, according to Ptolemy's account of the incident, nonetheless offered sacrifice in the hope of favourable omens for the crossing. When, however, the omens proved to be against him, he at last submitted, and having sent for the most senior officers of the hetairai, and those who were his own closest friends, made a public announcement that, as all circumstances combined to dissuade him from a further advance, he had decided upon withdrawal. One can imagine the shouts of joy which rose from the throats of the heterogeneous host. Most of them wept. They came to Alexander's tent and called down every blessing upon him for allowing them to prevail. The only defeat he had ever suffered.
11. He had a total disregard for the fear of death. Unbelievably brave and bold, Alexander would inspire his men with insane acts of valour, such as this.
The men with the ladders were not quick enough to satisfy Alexander. In his impatience he snatched one from the fellow who carried it, and with his own hands reared it against the fortress wall. Then, crouched under his shield, up he went. Procestus followed him with the sacred shield, the shield from the temple of Athene at Troy, which Alexander kept by him and had carried before him in battle. Procestus was followed by Leonatus, an officer of the guard, then Abraeus, one of the picked soldiers on double pay, mounted by a second ladder. The king had now reached the top. Laying his shield on the coping of the wall, he forced some of the defenders back into the fortress, cut down others with his sword, till he stood there on the battlements alone. Not one of the enemy within his reach. The sight of him filled the men of the long shields with terror for his safety. Scrambling for precedence, they made a dash for the ladders, but under the excessive load they broke and hurled the climbers to the ground. The rest were helpless. No Indian ventured to approach Alexander as he stood on the fortress wall, but he was the target of every marksman in the neighbouring towers. Men in the town shot at him too, and from no great distance either, as raised ground near the fortress wall brought them within closer range. And that it was indeed Alexander who stood there was plain to all. His almost legendary courage, no less than his shining armour, proclaimed him. Suddenly a thought crossed his mind. By staying where he was, he might well be killed with nothing accomplished. But if he leapt down into the fortress, he might by that very act spread consternation among the enemy. Or at least, if it was his fate to die, death would come not without a struggle, and as the crown of an exploit which would live upon the lips of men. To think was to act. Without further hesitation, he made his leap. Once inside the fortress, he put his back to the wall and made ready to fight. A party of Indians came at him, and he cut them down. Their commander rushed forward all too rashly, and he too fell. First one, then a second, who tried to approach him, he stopped with a well-aimed stone. Others pressed within striking distance, and fell victims to his sword. After that, none ventured again to attack him hand to hand. Keeping their distance, they formed a half-circle round where he stood, and hurled at him whatever missile they had or could find. By this time, Procestus, Abraeus, and Leonatus, the only men who succeeded in scaling the wall before the ladders collapsed, had got inside the fortress and were fighting in defence of their king. Abraeus was shot in the face and killed, and Alexander himself was hit, the arrow penetrating his corselet and entering his body above the breast. But Ptolemy tells us that the blood from the wound was mixed with air breathed out from the pierced lung. Despite the pain, he continued to defend himself so long as the blood was warm, but there was soon a violent hemorrhage, as was to be expected with a pierced lung. And overcome by giddiness and faintness, he fell forward over his shield. Procestus stood astride of his body, holding up before him the sacred shield from Troy, and Leonatus took his stand on the other side, both men being now the target for the enemy missiles, while Alexander himself was almost unconscious from loss of blood.
12. He marched his men through such barren lands that it caused more suffering to them than his entire Asian campaign had done, all so he could won better the deeds of those who came before him. Yep, I think by now you should be beginning to see just how unhinged of a man he was.
The next objective was the capital town of Gedrosa, situated in a district named Pura. The march thither from Maria occupied in all 60 days. Most historians of Alexander's campaigns have stated that the sufferings of his men on that march were out of all proportion greater than anything they had had to endure in Asia. Alexander did not choose that route because he was unaware of the difficulties it would involve. Nicetas is our one authority for this. He chose it because, apart from Semiramis on his retreat from India, no man, to his knowledge, had ever before succeeded in bringing an army safely through. Even Semiramis, according to local tradition, got through with no more than 20 survivors, and Cyrus, son of Cambyses, with only 7. For it is a fact that Cyrus came here with the intention of invading India, but found the going so bad and the country so wild and barren that he lost nearly all his men before he could do so. Alexander heard these old stories. They inspired him to go one better than Cyrus and Semiramis, and that was the reason, combined with the hope of being able to keep contact with the fleet and procure supplies for it, why, according to Nearchus, he marched by that route. The result was disastrous. The blazing heat and the lack of water caused innumerable casualties, especially among the animals, most of which died of thirst or from the effects of the deep burning sun-baked sand. Sometimes they met with lofty hills of sand, loose steep sand into which they sank, as if it were mud or untrodden snow. Sometimes, climbing or descending, the mules and horses suffered even greater distress from the uneven and treacherous surface of the track. Not the least hardship was the varying length of the marches, as the fact that they never knew when they would find water made regular normal marches impossible. It was not so bad when they found water in the morning after covering the requisite distance during the night, but when there was still further to go, and they found themselves plodding on and on as the day advanced, the double distress of heat and raging thirst was almost intolerable. Casualties among the animals were very numerous indeed. Most of them perished. Often they were killed deliberately by the men, who used to put their heads together and agree to butcher the mules and horses whenever supplies gave out, and then eat their flesh and pretend they had died of thirst or exhaustion. As every man was involved and the general distress was so great, there was no one to bring actual evidence of this crime, though Alexander himself was not unaware of what was going on. He realized, however, that the only way to deal with the situation was to feign ignorance, which would be better than to let the men feel that he connived at their breach of discipline. It was, moreover, no easy task, when men were sick or fell exhausted in their tracks, to get them along with the rest. Well, there were no transport animals left, and even the wagons were being continually broken up as it became more and more impossible to drag them through the deep sand. In the earlier stages of the march, they had often been prevented for this reason from taking the shortest route, and compelled to seek a longer one which was more practical for the teams. So there was nothing for it but to leave the sick by the way, and any man rendered incapable by exhaustion or thirst or sunstroke. No one could give them a helping hand. No one could stay behind to ease their sufferings, for the essential thing was to get on with all possible speed, and the effort to save the army as a whole inevitably took precedence over the suffering of individual men. Most of the marching was at night, and many men would fall asleep in their tracks. The few who had strength left to do so followed the army when they woke up again and got safe through, but the greater number perished, poor castaways in the ocean of sand. There was yet another disaster, perhaps the worst for all concerned: men, horses and mules. In Jadrosa, as in India, it rains heavily during the monsoon. The rain falls not on the plains but on the mountains, the summits of which arrest the clouds carried thither by the wind and cause them to condense in rain. It so happened that the army bivouacked by a small stream, for the sake of the water it afforded, and about the second watch of the night it was suddenly swollen by rain. The actual rain was falling far away out of sight, but the stream nevertheless grew into such a torrent that it drowned most of the camp followers, women and children, and swept away the royal tent with everything it contained, and all the surviving animals, while the troops themselves barely managed to escape, saving nothing but their weapons, and not even all of those. Another trouble was that when plenty of water happened to be found after a hot and thirsty march, most of the men drank so immoderately that the result was fatal to them. And for this reason Alexander usually made his halts a couple of miles or so from water, to stop his men from flinging themselves indiscriminately upon it to their own destruction, and that of their hearts, and to prevent those who had least self-control from plunging right into the spring or stream, or whatever it was, and so spoiling the water for the others. At this point in my story, I must not leave unrecorded one of the finest things Alexander ever did. Where it actually took place is uncertain. Perhaps here, perhaps as some historians have declared, in the country of the Parapamasade, some time previously. The army was crossing a desert of sand. The sun was already blazing down upon them, but they were struggling on under the necessity of reaching water, which was still far away. Alexander, like everyone else, was tormented by thirst, but he was nonetheless marching on foot at the head of his men. It was all he could do to keep going, but he did so, and the result, as always, was that the men were the better able to endure their misery when they saw that it was equally shared. As they toiled on, a party of light infantry which had gone off looking for water found some, just a wretched little trickle collected in a shallow gully. They scooped up what they could in a bladder and hurried back with their priceless treasure to Alexander. Then, just before they reached him, they tipped the water into a helmet and gave it to him. Alexander, with a word of thanks for the gift, took the helmet and, in full view of his troops, poured the water on the ground. So extraordinary was the effect of this action that the water wasted by Alexander was as good as a drink for every man in the army. I cannot praise this act too highly. It was a proof, if anything was, not only of his power of endurance, but also of his genius for leadership.
13. He accomplished all of his incredible deeds by the age of just 32 years and 8 months. The man lived an extraordinary life, one in a trillion or more. Here are some fitting closing words from the book.
Alexander died in the 114th Olympiad, in the archonship of Hegesias at Athens. He lived, as Aristobulus tells us, 32 years and 8 months, and reigned 12 years and 8 months. He had great personal beauty, invincible power of endurance, and a keen intellect. He was brave and adventurous, strict in the observance of his religious duties, and hungry for fame. Most temperate in the pleasures of the body, his passion was for glory only, and in that he was insatiable. He had an uncanny instinct for the right course in a difficult and complex situation, and was most happy in his deductions from observed facts. In arming and equipping troops and in his military dispositions, he was always masterly. Noble indeed was his power of inspiring his men, of filling them with confidence, and in the moment of danger of sweeping away their fear by the spectacle of his own fearlessness. When risks had to be taken, he took them with the utmost boldness, and his ability to seize the moment for a swift blow before his enemy had any suspicion of what was coming was beyond praise. No cheat or liar ever caught him off his guard, and both his word and his bond were inviolable. Spending but little on his own pleasures, he poured out his money without stint for the benefit of his friends. It is my belief that there was in those days no nation, no city, no single individual beyond the reach of Alexander's name. Never in all the world was there another like him, and therefore I cannot but feel that some power more than human was concerned in his birth. Indications of this were, moreover, said to be provided at the time of his death by oracles. Many people saw visions and had prophetic dreams. And there is the further evidence of the extraordinary way in which he is held, as no mere man could be, in honour and remembrance. Even today, when so many years have passed, there have been oracles, all tending to his glory, delivered to the people of Macedon. In the course of this book I have admittedly found fault with some of the things which Alexander did, but of the man himself I am not ashamed to express ungrudging admiration. Where I have criticised unfavourably, I have done so because I wished to tell the truth as I saw it, and to enable my readers to profit thereby. Such was the motive which led me to embark upon this history, and I too have had God's help in my work.
14. He was an incredible man, who led a truly unique life, but I think this best sums him up.
Alexander had Bessus brought before a full meeting of his officers and accused him of treachery to Darius. He then gave orders that his nose and the tips of his ears should be cut off, and that thus mutilated he should be taken to Ecbatana to suffer public execution before his own countrymen, the Medes and Persians. I do not myself approve the excessive severity of this punishment, for mutilation of that sort is, I think, a barbarous custom. I admit, moreover, that Alexander came to allow himself to emulate Eastern extravagance and splendour, and the fashion of barbaric kings of treating their subjects like dirt. Regrettable, too, was the assumption by a descendant of Heracles of Midian dress, in place of what Macedonians have worn from time immemorial, and the unblushing exchange of his familiar headgear, so long victoriously worn for the pointed bonnet of the vanquished Persians. I have no praise for such conduct, but in my opinion at least, the splendid achievements of Alexander are the clearest possible proof that neither strength of body, nor noble blood, nor success in war, even greater than Alexander's own, not even the realization of his dream of circumnavigating Libya and Asia and adding them both to his empire, together with Europe too, that none of these things, I say, can make a man happy, unless he can win one more victory in addition to those the world thinks so great, the victory over himself. Well, there we have it. 14 reasons why Alexander the Great was a bleeding lunatic. As I said at the beginning of this video, there is much more to discover about this remarkable man and his deeds. So if this has piqued your interest, please look into it further for yourself. These old accounts are, of course, best taken with a pinch of salt in terms of historical accuracy. But if my 40-odd years on this planet has taught me one thing, it is that truth is often far stranger than fiction. Hail to Alexander the Great! For better or worse, he was certainly one of a kind. And we can all learn a thing or two from that. Cheers, and thank you for watching.